So refactoring, like some say, like Uncle Bob say, it's a lifestyle for him, at least. I don't know if you agree. And this presentation, yeah, it's definitely a lifestyle for me as well. This presentation is about few practical examples of how we could refactor code, how we could simplify code. And I actually started writing this blog, or it's more just a collection of gists a few months ago about how code could be simplified. And the following examples that I'm going to show you are not wrong or bad code in any sense. They are just code that's more raw, or some kind of nicer word, I guess, to describe it. But the idea is just to try and take simple bits of code and try to make it better. And yes, let's start with a very simple example. So could one of you guys or girls tell me what's wrong with this? Or if it could be improved? I don't know. This bit of code has existed in so many code bases of my own. And whenever I come back, I'm like, what is this? Do you know, can you understand what it does? Oh, huh? Yeah, exactly. It's a collision check, whether the player collides with the enemy. So how could we make it better? Exactly. Nice one. So I have like a collection of like rules of thumb in a way, and this could be the first one. You should always name complex conditions, just because you don't remember what it did when you come back to the code. And this bit of code was actually, it wasn't from my own code base. It was from the classic Super Mario game. So yeah, it's a professional piece of code. And kind of like, you could maybe summarize this, that when you're reading through code and it doesn't make sense to you, then there's something, you found something to refactor. Of course, it's always not that black and white. Like, of course, you can just take any code base and say that, yeah, I don't remember, I don't understand this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad code, but sometimes when you read through code and reading it feels quite fluent, but then it stops somewhere, then you know that there's something there that could be formulated a bit better. Next example. What's wrong with this? There might be plenty of things wrong with this, but I'm looking for one thing. And it's about the signature of the function.
It doesn't always return users, it might return just one.
Yes, exactly. This is actually quite common in many code bases. And well, can you explain what it does? Like, if you have code like that, what's the effect of it? You code around it. Is there such a thing? How does it? Why should it be made better?
Well, it'll lead to like more checks in sort of like client code, whatever code uses it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pain in the ass for the caller. Next up, this is probably like, this is maybe from one of my own code bases I wrote like maybe 5-6 years ago, even though it was PHP, but this is a JavaScript port of that code. So what's wrong with it? How could we make it better?
Ugly.
It's ugly. That's for sure. Yep.
Too much nesting, that's the issue.
Yep, true. So we could make it flat, and we could turn those if statements kind of the other way around to achieve that. And there's also another point that when you manage to change the if conditions that way, then you can also more easily define like the boundaries, the argument boundaries of that function right there in the beginning. And kind of you could also say that those are like the edge cases of the function. And once that part is done completely, once we get through that part of those checks, then all of the other code, all of the other function body can just be kind of like the happy case, the happy path. So I guess you don't have to have that much code there then. And with nested code, I was just thinking about this morning actually. You kind of introduce another dimension to the code. Like usually when we read code, it's from top to bottom. It's kind of like one-dimensional in a sense. But when you do nesting, it becomes two-dimensional. And then you could do recursion, for instance, and then you would have the third dimension there as well. And then it gets really complicated. But that example, for me at least, took a bit more to understand like what's going on. When you have loads of different conditions there, it's really hard to try and comprehend like what are the actual boundaries for those arguments. And that's why I would argue that refactoring code is a tool for understanding code as well, and a tool for reading through code. If you have a new code base, for instance, it's a perfectly valid way of reading it and understanding it. It is to, while you're reading it, you could just do like small refactors here and there, like the ones that we saw. Next up, this is a simple one. What could we change?
Return the condition.
Yeah, exactly. Nice one. This is something you see way too often, because you could just simplify it like this. And well, you could argue that the whole function is kind of redundant, I guess. But you see that quite often, and it's kind of just about the small cues. When you're doing code reviews, for instance, you can just see that whenever you see something like that, it usually leads you into something a bit greater. Because I guess at least my thinking is that it's because whenever you're using a tool that you're not that familiar with, like we all have probably had the experience of starting out with something new, and we're not that sure how it should be used. We can read the documentation, but everything we do is you're always questioning yourself if this is like the actual way of doing things right with this tool. And when you're writing code with a tool like that, a tool that you're not that familiar with, you're kind of just trying to keep your head afloat. You're trying not to drown. And usually you're happy with the code just working. And you don't really have that much mental energy to try and make it perfect, because you don't even know what perfect looks like. Or well, there's no such thing as perfect, I guess, in programming, but you don't know the conventions that well. Next up, really complicated one. This is actually from our own code base, our own project. And there's plenty of stuff here that could be refactored, but just take a look at it and just shout out if you have ideas what's wrong with it, what could be made better. Edu is just looking at it like, gosh.
My God. if the date is an ISO string, you can compare them.
Yeah.
The strings there.
Do that. How about the function? Is it too complex?
Well, yeah, there's like 15 lines or groups of 8 lines where there's one character difference between those two. There's
Yeah.
a whole lot of repetition that
Sure.
maybe could be taken away somehow.
I actually have a refactored version of it here. It's not the next slide, but the one after that. But some of the ideas that I had were that you could have 2 functions as a starting point. You could have 2 different functions, like sort by date, ascending, and sort by date, descending. And you could do the switch between those 2 function calls in the component render method, for instance. So you would kind of like push the configuration upwards. And in that way, you would make the function a bit more generic. What do you think about the plus sign before the new date call? What does it do? Yeah,
I didn't notice
yeah.
that before.
It's super confusing. It's kind of like a magic trick in a way. Like when you're reading through this code, and especially if you're not that familiar with JavaScript, it's just like, is this part of the syntax really? But what it does, it what's the word? It turns the date object into a number. Type conversion. How about the return part of all of this? It has like 3 different cases. It has 3 different conditions, ascending, descending, and then the default case is that it returns an empty array, which is of course the same value to return from a sorting function. And in a typed language, you probably wouldn't even have this issue, because you could define that the value parameter is also named a bit weirdly. At least in my opinion, it could be something like order. Anyway, my point is to demonstrate that this is just less than 100 lines of code, but you could come up with plenty of different rules of thumb that you could apply to other code samples as well. Code specimen. And here's this super small, I don't know if you can even read it, but here was the version or the way I refactored it myself. Is it too small?
Kind of.
Okay, all right. Well, let's not go too deep into that then. But the thing is, in my opinion, that being able to refactor a code base, it's a measure of something. It's a measure of maintainability, and kind of like maintainability in itself is kind of like an umbrella term for many things, like readability, for instance, or what were the other ones that we discussed yesterday? Well, plenty of things, trust me. And you can't refactor a spaghetti code. It's just too difficult. It's too difficult to change anything. And you can't refactor anything that doesn't have tests. So it's kind of like a measure of a good code base. Of course, there are plenty of other things that are also part of something being good of a code base. But this is one thing. And in my opinion, starting to refactor, like all of these things that we did were quite small. Like just you saw something small, you fixed it, you learned the code base while doing it. And in my opinion, these huge refactor, some even do like huge refactor sprints, are usually a bad idea, because those are really hard to. Well, it's really hard to measure the value of them, and those can be quite expensive and really hard to justify for the stakeholders or the client. And even Angelbob says this about refactoring, that it should be a part of the process, just like testing, for instance. It's like washing your hands in the bathroom. Great analogy. And what we've done in our current project is that whenever we see something wrong and we don't have time to fix it now, I don't know if it comes to refactoring or if it's just technical debt, but what we do is we just create an issue of it. And I think Uncle Bob is kind of, I don't know if that's a bit black and white what he says. I think you can take issues as tasks to the sprint and kind of see how you do it otherwise. You have to kind of somehow bake in the refactoring and fixing those issues and paying the technical debt to the process, the day-to-day work. Anyway, what's useful is that you can create lists like this of your own as well. Whenever you're reading through code, just try and find generic ways of describing the problems in the code that you have, and then try and apply those same rules to other code bases, other pieces of code. Could be yours or someone else's. And there are plenty of great resources also for figuring out what's good code or clean code. Like this, it was actually quite nice. Clean code JavaScript. And Google it. And I mentioned the blog or gist that I did before, and you can find it from the bit.li address, Refactoring Friday. I moved it there. There's a few tips that I've found useful. Anyway, questions?
I have a comment. I think one thing really worth mentioning is that when you do refactoring, it's a good idea to always keep it in separate commits, because that makes reviewing the code changes a lot easier. Because if you put refactoring and logical changes to the same commit, then the refactoring part gets quite difficult to spot from there.
Yes, that's an excellent point, actually. And usually, when you refactor something, or when you're writing new code, that's when you find those places to refactor. And it's quite tempting to just go ahead and refactor those while you're there.
Yeah, I was just about to ask this as well, and about your when you said that you would create issues. So I guess if you did this, you wouldn't bother to create an issue. You just fix it, but you fix it in a different commit. But we're talking about a workflow where you actually do review commit by commit.
Well, we've used like either if you end up doing like a bit bigger refactoring before starting to implement a new feature, you might do a small separate PR first from the refactoring. Or if they're in the same PR, you might say in the description that please review this like commit by commit, or the first couple of commits contain the refactoring, and then usually that's one way of instructing the readers. But usually if the same commit contains like refactoring and changes, then it's more difficult to see what has actually changed. Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. Anything else anyone wants to add? Yes. Channel one back there.
I guess a statement more than a question. One point for not including the refactoring in the actual backlog is that if you make a task that's refactor this, then it kind of gives the PO an option to never include it in the sprint, and then it never gets done. You know that it needs to be done, and then it just grows.
Fair point.
Yeah, just do it.
Yeah. And you could even like in sprint planning, you could have a separate backlog just for these secret stories that the PO doesn't have to know about. All right, any more? Tommy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really agree with the comment that you should constantly do small improvements to the code base every single time you touch it.
Yep.
Instead of like being afraid to not make something better, even if you like when you're doing some other tasks.
Totally. Kind of keeps the code base fresh in a sense, and flexible, like I said. It has to be able to adapt and evolve. Anything? Any more? Another one.
So the whole premise in the beginning was kind of that it's a matter of readability and how easily you understand the code.
Yeah.
But as we all know, different coders understand different code differently. So how do you tackle the situation where, for example, you're changing a conditional, making it one variable, and then you, for example, have some prettier rules that make the code flow like in a completely horrible way because of that?
Yeah, kind of like formatting and
Yeah.
readability through that. That's a good point. What I always think is, well, first of all, Prettier is a great tool in my opinion. I've never had, at first when I tried using it, it felt like it had so many like small annoying things, and everyone was saying the same thing. But what I think is that you just kind of get used to those things.
But I guess my point was like when you're making a refactoring commit, you're making the code better for yourself.
Yep.
But then if someone disagrees with that, then how do you diffuse the situation?
I don't know. Maybe it's kind of on case-by-case basis. Like I wouldn't. The reason why I like Prettier, for instance, so much is that it kind of takes away the need for fighting over any small stuff. Of course, there are like. Also, you could argue that, for instance, the example that I showed about turning the if statements flat like this, you could also argue that, hey, that's not. I prefer this. It's more readable to me. I don't know. Because there's no like really. It's not really objective in a way. Yeah, that's a good question. Does anyone else have ideas? What would you do? What would you do, Ilkka?
I would carefully choose the hill that I want to die on.
Yeah, that's true. Philip has a question.
I think we had this discussion also in our project that especially small formatting things where like people had different ideas of, hey, I want this line there on the back, and then the guy who hasn't done JavaScript says like, why is there a line on the back? I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I think we came to the conclusion that these small things, which doesn't really make much of a visual change, you just, if you're in the flow and you commit this, you do it. If you have it, but you don't start changing it everywhere where everybody else committed it. So it's okay to have a line, and sometimes maybe not a line.
Yeah.
In the end, it doesn't matter. I think fighting over those makes no sense. But then, when we have bigger questions about readability, I think then it's more like a team decision. Like it's like you review it. If one person says, I want it different, and all the others say, no, it's okay, then, well, you have to accept it's okay.
Yeah.
My opinion.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I have nothing to say to that, except for I agree. It's a difficult thing in any project, for sure. And I think like if we would get some automation and tooling to get rid of those discussions altogether, then what would be better than that? Anyway, thanks a lot for your. Do you have a question? No. Thanks a lot for your time. Yes, go ahead. Yes, thank you.